welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening in the beginning of Architecture Week 2023. We have some wonderful visitors this week from various parts of the world who are reviewing the work in the project reviews and the work in progress reviews. And we've invited a few of them to make presentations to our community this week and invited our friends to join us. This evening, we have Renske van Dam, Dr. Renske van Dam, who's visiting us from the Netherlands. Tomorrow evening, Cruz Garcia and Natalie Frankowski, who are based in Iowa, from Puerto Rico and France, respectively, will be speaking about their work. And on Thursday, Professor Andrew Clancy from Dublin, who's a professor at Kingston University, will be presenting his practice. Cruz and Natalie are also going to be doing a workshop with the M2 students on Thursday morning, and also with Simpiwe Mlambo, who's one of our tutors, are going to be doing a panel discussion. That will be a closed session that will be subsequently be a podcast. Secrets. No, they're going to be talking about land and various movements and agencies around land in the world. So a project that we want to develop. But this evening is Renske's evening. I met Renske in Barcelona. I'm part of a PhD, practice-based PhD community there that I revisit, and where also I met Andrew. We've all done practice-based PhDs, and speaking to Renske in Barcelona and learning a bit about her research, I thought it would be really useful to have her here to share our work with her, and also for her to share her perspectives and her interests in a variety of different practices that I think in really quite curious and interesting ways intersect with many of our own interests at the GSA. This is recorded, so it'll be available online. And for those purposes, I'm going to read out her bio as a form of introduction so that you have a clear kind of understanding of her background. Renske is an architect, artist and academic whose work exploits tiny perceptions to open up alternative worlds of experience and action. She calls for a fundamental shift in the way we conceive and construct the built environment, from an architecture of objects to an architecture of reciprocity. With biotopological craftsmanship, a craftsmanship not of wood, but of social and ecological relationships, she promotes an empathic, animistic and affirmative approach to architectural practice, research and pedagogy. Renske has a PhD in architecture conducted through Radical Materiality Research Group at KU Leuven in Brussels and Ghent, and she specialized in the correspondence and divergence between the Japanese spatio-temporal practice of Ma and recent findings in the cognitive sciences that emphasize the centrality of the moving body for the experience of architectural space. She graduated from the TU Delft Faculty of Architecture in the Netherlands with additional studies in Asian conceptions of space-time, the TU Delft Honours Programme, and in the philosophy, sociology, and anthropology of cities at Leiden University. Her work draws upon her amateur background as a theatrical performer, a zookeeper, and a yogi. I don't think I've ever introduced somebody with that collection of it's pretty interesting CV there, Renske, you know. As much as she does on her professional engagement with architecture. She's worked with Herman Hertzberger in Amsterdam, Atelier Li Xiaodong, I hope I've said that correctly, in Beijing, in China, and on her pedagogical involvement at the University of the Arts in The Hague. She's developed her practice as an artist and researcher in residence at diverse organizations, among which Slow Research Lab Amsterdam, the Architectural Body Research Foundation in New York, the United States, Kansai University, and the Sense Lab, Laboratory for Thought in Motion in Bendigo, Australia. Her work is internationally supported, exhibited, and published both in and outside academia. So Renske, welcome. We're looking forward to your presentation, and over to you.
Just check if your mic is on. Thank you. Well, thank you. This is also what I want to start my presentation just with a bit. Thank you for the invitation. I just said it to a few of you. Everybody is thanking us for coming here, but I feel very, very honored to be here and to come in conversation with you. And I want to talk today a little bit about transformation, or start my talk a little bit with a note about transformation, because I've used the word transformation for my practice all the time because I believe architecture practice is in transformation, and I very much like to be part of that in some way. I feel like we are expanding the idea of what architecture can be, what architecture can do. And at the same time, as maybe became already a little bit clear in my bio, I am also somebody who is just going through different cultures, different disciplines, and integrating different perspectives to what architecture can do and be. At the same time, I'm very much aware that how I understand transformation might be very different from how transformation is understood here. Mark has informed me a little bit already about this, and this is all new to me. That I just had a small talk with you already about the differences between the world I work in and live in and how you experience it. And this is also how I see the talk tonight, just as a starting point for us to start a conversation about this and talk more and get to know each other a little bit better. Just to give a broad overview, for me, architecture practice, so I was trained as an architect at TU Delft. I worked with Hetzberger, I worked with Li Xiaojong in Beijing. Self-employed, I did a lot of participatory urban design interventions where sometimes it was self-commissioned or I started the project myself. Sometimes this was more general for the whole city, organized like that. But my practice also looks like this. Far more speculative, far more experimental, and evolves around moving bodies, or how do we experience space through and with our body. And I think this is also what I'm going to talk about today, most of it. And I'm curious to see how you experience this or what you think about this. In that sense, I like to think about transformation a little bit like this. I was reminded about this ad. You can read it very closely. And sometimes, to me, architecture is a little bit like this, or the work I do is a little bit like this. You don't have to change anything about the structure or the built environment that there is, but you just need to change the way you interact with it, or you look at it. In this sense, read the text upside down, and you have a totally different perspective on the world. Have you read it? Yeah. So, my PhD. My PhD is called Working Within the Gap. And it actually started when I visited this installation by Arakawa and Gins. This is a Japanese-American artist/architect duo. And this installation is built in Japan, in a little village in a museum. And when you enter it, you enter it somewhere around in the back. There's a spiral stair coming up. The world is hovering around you and creating an interesting experience of both place and movement at the same time. Well, when I visited this installation, I was quite enthusiastic about it, so I texted one of my, I think it was the supervisor of my master from TU Delft, and he said, but do you remember your graduation project from your master actually looked like this? And I thought, oh yeah, I totally forgot about that. Maybe I have to think a little bit more about what actually interests me in this kind of movements. And this master project was all about how do you experience place while you are in movement. And there was only one concept that I bumped into up until then that somehow captured this sense of place within movement. This is just to give you a reference of the picture you just saw. It was a long bridge between China and Hong Kong. This concept was called Ma. You see the character for Ma here. And if you look at the character, you can understand it like this. So this is the character for door. And then in between, you see the sign for moon or for sun. that goes between a gap in the door. So if you open the door, the sun or the moon light streams through it, and it actually tries to explain this sense of in-between place, but not as a gap, not as an empty space, but where something is happening, where something is activated. So you can, for example, also see it in this installation, where you see a stair going up, but then there is a simple pause before actually you reach the platform. So I thought, oh, this is an idea about space or a sense of space that I'm super interested to learn more about, and that in my education I had never addressed or worked with. And you can also see it in Japanese architecture specifically, when, to make it a little bit more practical, when you have two worlds that are connected through a lot of different stages. So it's all about making visible actually in between space. Or if you would say we have two classes here, it's all about making sensible, working with what's happening here. What we usually address as nothing or emptiness. And I wanted to understand this better in the context of actually two more theoretical works. One is a book from the early 90s already, The Embodied Mind, where actually the researchers make a connection between the understanding of mindfulness practices, also coming from Buddhism, and computer science, starting to understand that how we experience the world is not from a stable standpoint. It's very much involves your body, involves movement, and involves your environment. You cannot really think without all those ingredients. And in architecture, this of course also inspired a new way of thinking or different ways of thinking about how we experience the world. And for me, it was all about figuring out spatial tactics. How can I actually work with this nothingness? How can I approach this gap? And how could that maybe change my perspective to what I've learned about architecture up until now? So how did I approach this? This concept of mass, specifically in architecture practice, was introduced by Japanese architect Arata Isozaki. So you have to understand a little bit here that this concept is often understood as a Japanese concept, and it is also formed in Japanese language, but ma as such is very much something that exists in architecture practice. Let's say it like that. It's not used as I'm going to explain right now in Japanese regular language. But in architecture, Isozaki has made a contribution to this and tried to bring or open up new fields in working with this. So I did all my research in close collaboration with him. And specifically, I looked at the exhibition Ma Spacetime in Japan, which he prepared to be shown in Paris and in New York. And in this exhibition, what he does, he used references from traditional Japanese architecture from the Edo period, but also spatial rituals from Shinto religion, so very ancient rituals. And he combined this and brought this to, for him, contemporary, but back then postmodern context. So he started to play with this and make iterations. Like if you make a spatial ritual from Shinto religion, how would this look like in Edo period? How would this look like in postmodern practice? And then, for example, he would make references to Mondrian-esque experiences and see how this goes. So for me, this was an entrance to also start iterating on the practices he presented in the exhibition and see, okay, how can I then work with it? So one of the first projects I did was together with students from the Royal Academy of Arts in The Hague and from the TU Delft. And we took the exhibition as such, and everybody was just picking a small project which was in the exhibition, and then we started to experiment. And it were all bodily experiments. So it was just, we were looking at the work and then, okay, we start to iterate on that. So the classroom was looking like this all the time. We were just experimenting and see, okay, how does this... Here we are testing how strings sound when you play with it, for example. And based on this, we made a performance that we showed on TU Delft. And to give you an idea of the performance, I will read out a description from an audience member, so you kind of understand how the experience of the performance was. I enter a dark room. A man with rectangular silver hands and a silver face causes the air to shimmer. He slowly pushes and pulls the space back and forth. The woman sitting on the ground has a wooden board laying in front of her. On this board, 3 planes of glass are arranged in an accurate manner. With a piece of paper, she covers one of them. Carefully, she weighs down the paper with 4 stones, 1 on each corner. Then she picks up another stone, and with 1 quick and strong blow, she smashes the glass plate. Now it's quiet again. The curtain opens a bit, letting in a ray of sunlight. A puppeteer, holding 2 angled copper rods, creates shapes on the ground. She is concentrated and calm, creating spatial constellations while guiding her 2 minions through space. An angry chief claims his territory by executing an intimidating dance. He claps on a heavy instrument made of wooden pieces all in a row, continuing until the heavy instrument is destroyed. Another area draws my attention. Illuminated by a curtain pulled to the side, allowing just a glimpse of 2 women entangled in a dance-like choreography with 2 angled coppered rods, rotating and revolving through space, creating a spatial constellation. I think that this exhibition of performances is meant to be seen by architects. The performances are experiments in real space. They are one-to-one models presenting the experimental and sensuous aspects of the process of design and designing itself. What did I get from working with students and going through this exhibition? Because somehow it also feels like a very abstract and very mystic process. What were we doing and what were we gaining from this? Well, one of my students made a comment or wrote a little poem about it, and he said, "Can I see Ma? Can I hear Ma? Can I smell Ma? Can I touch Ma? Can I feel Ma? Can I control Ma? Is there something I must grasp? Ma is here and there and everywhere. We do not create Ma, we pay homage to Ma. Do I become Ma-aware?" And when he submitted this to me, I was like, I think this is one of the starting points which makes it interesting to work this is because you create a different kind of sighted awareness. You become very much aware of what it means to be embodied and active, embedded, extended, and effective. So what do I mean with this? For example, what we figured out is, if you turn your head and look between your legs like this, actually, the horizon always stays on the upside. It's really like your head is already noticing, okay, I use my body, I'm in a different position, but still, it's always, the air is always blue on the upside. You can try it if you want. It's really weird experience, and suddenly you start to realize, oh, this is very much connected to each other. In the same way, as the bartender uses, remembers his order by thinking, okay, if you want wine, I place a wine glass on the bar, and then somebody orders 3 beers, I place 3 orders on it. So he doesn't remember it in his head. He will use all the glasses to remember it. In the same way, we use the whole environment actually to make our spatial and normal day of experience. We walk actually with the environment, with this. This is something how I would explain it. But it is sometimes very hard to grasp, but if you go through these processes, you start to get a better sense of this. But then still, what can you do with this as an architect? So I continued my research, and I picked one of the other elements of the exhibition, which was a performance by Min Tanaka. It's a body weather performance artist. You see him here in Paris and in Japan doing his performances. And his performances are all about getting attuned to the environment. So even enlarging this form of sighted awareness. And to get a better understanding of it, I also started to take a class. So a lot of my research looked like this. I was just immersed in spaces and tried to understand what happens here. And at a certain point, I also started to get my students involved. So we went for the beach, and we were, well, you cannot really see it on the image, but it was very hard wind. I think actually in the back you see also one of my students really going for it. And then we also started to do this inside the faculty. So people in the offices would see us passing by. Not only for us, this was really interesting experience, but also for the others. Or in the classroom, we would explore spaces in these ways. And this was all based on the diverse set of rules and practices from the body weather that I more and more simplified for architects to actually also work with it. And then I started to understand that you could use this form of exploration as part of your site analysis. So instead of only focusing on the hard properties and where the buildings are and where the water is, you can use your own body to explore the sensuous parts of the experiences. So one of the first projects I did this in was a project called Sensing Shipyard, where we went to the Damen shipyard in Amsterdam and also started to explore the site with our senses in different ways. So sometimes, this is one of my colleagues, she really enjoyed it, but she's also going into, okay, what are the vibrations of this space? How does it work? One of my students. And we also allowed ourselves to not only use our body, but also use technical devices to amplify this form of research. And at the same time, we kept on using our normal skills. So we would also do interviews or just making normal plans of the site to work with it. And to capture this more sensuous parts of the field research, we started to make something what I would refer to as intensive cartography. So in a very free way, people were asked to capture their experience in a certain sense. Sometimes focusing on just a small spot, sometimes more from an anthropological perspective, including the site. Or sometimes this is a map of all the different sounds from two different machine halls. And then she would make these forms of map as a way of inspiration. Eventually, this project led to a experiential cartography where you could actually walk through and experience it, the site on a different location, and was presented at Sonic Acts. Maybe if we have time later, we can also watch the video. Another project where I used this form of movement practice is Tiny Perceptions. It's also a pedagogical project at the rooftop of the Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam, where we started to use this not as a means of site analysis, but also as a way of designing. So again, we started with very bodily exploration. Here you see the whole group actually moving with one of the banners that was flying on the rooftop. So the first days always look a little bit like this. And everybody in their own way is exploring the site. But here soon we would also include materials. Found materials that were usually close by. Because it was on an art academy, there were also a lot of found materials around. And if they were in the exploration fascinated with the sun, they started to work with the sun. or to experiment with the wind. And what you see when you start to do is that students get much more attentive to really small details. For example, here the students wanted to work with the wind, and they wanted to somehow make an installation that would show that. But after a rain, all the wood was really, like, it wouldn't even move anymore in the wind. So they needed to invent a different kind of care for the material. And here you see they wanted to work with the air that came out of the ventilation. And they all came up with very, bodily experiences, actually, to make this. In the same way, also in the design process, the body was often much more used to decide on a certain size of the installation. So it should be as big that somebody can lay down in it, for example, or work like this. And again, focus on the details. After a lot of these forms of experimentation, I said, okay, I have a form of movement practice now for architects, actually, that I can work with, and also changes the way we can talk about and experience space. Because if you start to do this, also the conversations in the classroom, at least in my experience, started to be different, or about different experiences and different things. I start to be very much aware that I am relatively tall, small, short, and that a lot of my students had a completely different sound experience of most of the sites we were experiencing. But also students from different disciplines, or students from different cultural backgrounds, come up with a completely different experience of the spaces we have there. And for me, this was all a way of shifting the focus from the object that we are making to this empty space that we are working in. But I also wanted a little bit more. I wanted to have more architectural ways of approaching this. So this was the second line of iteration I started to work with, which was based on one of the other installations in the exhibition, which was a Japanese tea house. So I visited this Japanese tea house, and I thought, oh, maybe I can use this moving and listening and breathing with also as a way to understand how actually the architecture is built up. Here you see a floor plan and a little section of how the tea house looks like. But because this was Japanese heritage, I wasn't not allowed to work on the site itself. So I started to make a testing ground in a dance studio in The Hague. And based on the floor plans and the information I had, I started to abstract the different movement complexities that you could see in the tea house. For example, you see here, if you talk about the zigzagging pathway that leads to the entrance of the tea house, I would study this by zigzagging myself. Not only in the studio, but also just through space. I think for months I was just walking every time like this to start to understand what actually does this movement mean or do for my experience of space. And I would work through this all the time. This project eventually led to a spatial installation called Zigzagging, in which I also invited others to experience what and how zigzagging can influence your experience of space on a larger scale and on a smaller scale. And by that time, it was COVID, but I also still wanted to continue my research. So I also started to make small interventions based on this tea house, but then in my own house. So for example, in a Japanese tea house, you enter always through a very small door. You always have to crawl through. And I wanted to explore this. And another thing that fascinated me was that the placement of the windows is always very low or very high, and that it very much reflects the sunlight in certain ways at certain moments in the year. So, for example, in the specific tea house where I was, the reflection of the sun through one of the windows was only happening at one point in autumn when the leaves of the tree outside were on the perfect growth and the sun would reflect like this. And I thought this kind of sense that you build a certain architecture only for this one moment to experience, how does that relate to my own experience of it? So this is in my house. This is a never published project, but I really liked it because it was in my own space, so I could test actually the experiences for 2 or 3 months instead of just one moment. So this is the door where everybody had to go in and out, and I myself also did this. But the weird thing is that if you start doing this the first time, it feels very weird. But then after a week or after 2 weeks, I could go through it with groceries. It doesn't really matter anymore. Your body really adjusts very quickly. And then for the windows, I did the same. And it actually works because you become much more aware of how the sun affects my room and how the rhythm also changes over the year and where the sunlight is reflected. So I did more projects than I show here, but the final conclusion out of it for me was it's not only this moving and listening and breathing with the space, but also the architecture itself by specific movement sequences activates actually that I am more relying on the environment itself. So instead of walking a straight line, where you can usually just see where you're going, if you go zigzagging, it involves always different perspectives, and you cannot really see where you're going, so you need to rely more, for example, on the gravity. The same thing with the rotation of the sun and the windows. You need to rely on the rotation of the sphere a little bit more. And I started to understand that all these small interventions are actually activating a different relationship to the world around me through using my body and inviting my body to act in a different way than at least the architecture that I normally experience in Western architecture invited me to do. And if you're interested in it, because now I just explain it through my own experience, but there is also there are much more examples than only the tea house in different forms of architecture that actually activate and use this. So it's part of a broader framework, but I thought today I'll just explain it through my practice. So for me, it started to be, this whole research through Ma started to be a way of understanding how I could build dynamic relationships between me as a moving body and also the other moving bodies, like the sun. And for me, this is actually what Mark already explained in my bio. For me, this is a switch between thinking about architecture as an object to thinking about architecture as a way to build relationships in different ways. So this all resulted in this book, where I combined the architectural theory with all the different experiences I had through the project I did. And then I was a little bit, okay, what can we do with it now? It's a nice research. And then you're finishing and think, oh, yeah, I kind of have said what I wanted to say. How can I apply this to my practice? Especially because I have also this experience of working in a much more regular architecture office. And I felt like, I can make the combination here somehow, but sometimes it also feels very abstract and it's very far away. And I think I'm still in the middle of that process. I'm still trying to figure it out. And explaining what I've done to different other people and involving other people in it is part of this exploration. So I still make testing grounds. And one of the testing grounds is, for example, this one, where I continued this relation with the sun. So this project was totally built on how the sun enters this exhibition space and how the different materials work with this and how you can move the different frames through it. And then my practice still looks like this. So I always start with, okay, how does this project work? How does this work? Because I understood it as a kind of matching and meshing. If you are in social interaction, we also match and mesh. So if I want to communicate with you, I make movements. And this is, sometimes other people reflect my movements. So this is called meshing, if you do exactly the same. Meshing is it when I throw the ball and somebody catches. So you do actually a meaningful action back. And I transferred this understanding of building a dynamic relationship to the built environment. But then first I need to understand through my body what this actually means. So this is how my practice. Yeah. But still, everybody needs to get home safely at a certain point. So you can see here a little bit of how, like, these testing grounds look like. And what I do, I invite other people, and we start to see how matching and meshing works and what this actually means for us. And then at a certain point, we start to work and integrate materials to relate this to the, yeah, I can skip a little bit of all the, oh yeah, here you can see how we start to, in the same way as we worked with each other, involve the material and work from there and see how we can translate this to a relation with the sun. And then for this case, it resulted in different panels and different textures that you can work and activate with this. And I think some of you have seen the other video already when we showed it, and I will put it on a little bit. Oh, not this one. So you see, this is actually a testing ground that is to be experienced over a 12-hour time slot. And then you see how the different moments of the sun are activated in different moments of the day and how the performance moves through. And at the same time, I am starting to apply it more to the built environment as it is in the Netherlands at the moment. And this is, for example, a project that I'm working on right now. It's called Hugging Architecture. And it deals with this building. It's a new cultural center built by Noah Architects. It houses 4 of this kind of huge theater rooms, and in between, and it houses a conservatoire for students. So, and in between there's a large public space. And these are really nice renders where you see different kind of uses of the space, but in reality the space is empty. And the reality of this empty public space is that people that work in the building are often confronted with homeless people, and there are little struggles, little fights. And I always say this is part of public space. This friction is the beauty of public space. But if people completely start to pull back because of this. Something is not working. And in the beginning, when this building was opened, the students of the conservatoire actually had the same problem. They really didn't feel at home in this building. So I said, okay, let's start a pedagogical project here where we work with this team and see how you can work with it. So again, here in this building, we started to do the movement practice, which eventually resulted again in kind of little interventions in the building that invited the users to interact with the environment a little in a different way. So one of the installations is this. An installation is this, where you can listen to another part of the building. Another installation was this, where everybody was invited to work with the building in a different way. And you could just rip one of the things and actually do it. And to my own surprise, this happened a lot. Sometimes you never know if people actually are going to do it if you make this invitation, but this happened a lot. And this is also why the inhabitants of this building now have asked me to do the same process, but then together with the homeless people and the people that work there, and see where we go from there. And for me, this is a totally new experience because this is a different kind of user group than the students I normally work with. And I have no idea if movement practice is the right way to do it. And I don't know. I'm also not really sure if I'm going to do it like that. But I like the invitation, and I will see what we come up with. And maybe this will result in different build installations, but maybe again, it's just a different way of approaching what is already there and how people use the space and work with that. So in that sense, for me, it's also a little switch from the pedagogical project to the more practices. A same switch that might happen here at the moment. And I don't know where it will end, but I'm kind of looking forward to it. And I hope to work somewhere between the different experiences that I had already so far. And then we'll see what comes up. When I was thinking about transformative pedagogies or transformative practices, I was reminded of something that happened during my first year as an architecture student. The building burned down completely. And it was a bit unrealistic experience because this building by Broek en Bakema actually had a lot of the Dutch architect community really had stories in this building, and they really appreciated the building. But for me as a student, I actually quite liked that we didn't have a building anymore. Because for me, it forced me to go back into the city, out into the world. And I think somehow that the way I'm involving my body and I like to go out was somehow sparked in there. And I saw it also already in the projects happening here. You go outside of the building a lot. And I very much like this idea of architecture practicing not from a distance, not only behind your computer, but also going out there. So if there's one thing that I take out of all this research, it's just sometimes you don't need the building. Just go out. And then I wanted to end with this quote. And that was it. Thank you.